Good morning, everyone. Kwe, hello, bonjour. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. C'est un grand honneur d'être ici à Montréal, un endroit qui a longtemps servi de lieu de rencontre et d'échange entre les nations. It is indeed a great honor to be with you today here in Jojage, in Montreal, situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among many First Nations. I want to thank the woman immediately on my left, on your right, National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepenak, for the invitation to speak with all of you here today in person. I also want to acknowledge all of the chiefs, knowledge keepers, elders, youth representatives, and other distinguished attendees who are here today, both on the dais with me and immediately in front of me. I had the pleasure of speaking with some of you during the permanent bilateral mechanism meeting of the AFN leaders and federal cabinet ministers just last month. This process is a very important priority for our government. Working directly with you, Indigenous leaders and partners, was a commitment we made when we came into office first in 2015. The ongoing dialogue is an essential part of our broader work around nation rebuilding and reconciliation. That work includes ensuring that the rights of First Nations and all Indigenous peoples are upheld, recognized, and respected, and that Indigenous legal traditions thrive and coexist alongside Canadian law. Nous sommes également déterminés à favoriser l'autodétermination et l'autonomie gouvernementale des peuples autochtones, notamment en prenant des mesures sur des priorités communes et en promouvant les droits et les intérêts des Premières Nations. Today, I want to reflect on how much we have accomplished together, as well as talk about the work still yet to come, particularly related to the UN Declaration Act Action Plan, so the UNDA Action Plan, as well as the Indigenous Justice Strategy. So let me start first with the UNDA Action Plan. I can say to you that we would not have an action plan without the legislation that was first passed by Parliament, the first Parliament that I sat in, the 42nd Parliament. When we passed this, we committed to implementing the UN Declaration, and we worked together with you in this room, to pass the law that brought us to where we are today. The UN Declaration Act reflects your priorities, which you communicated to all of us in Ottawa. Important steps have been taken on our joint work to implement the UNDA Action Plan. Throughout the process, we have worked with Indigenous partners to ensure accountability and transparency in how we collectively implement UNDA and the Action Plan itself. And First Nations, including all of you, have made their priorities clear, and we are working with you to incorporate them. Your guidance to me and to my fellow cabinet ministers has been invaluable. In particular, the newly established AFN Chiefs Committee on the UN Declaration will be a strong and very compelling voice as we work to align Canada's laws and policies with the UN Declaration. We are also working bilaterally with First Nations, governments, and representative organizations at the regional and community level, ensuring their priorities are equally represented in this effort. And we continue to benefit from the tremendous leadership of Regional Chief Terry Teegee. Chief Teegee, I'm not sure where he is right now, but well, he's walking up, right, just on cue. I wanted to thank you, Terry, for your leadership and your experience in implementing the UN Declaration in British Columbia. Thanks. I feel like we're on sort of a 2-week cycle now, me and Terry, because I saw him at the PBM. I saw him when we were out in Chilcotin territory celebrating a very important landmark Supreme Court of Canada ruling giving the Chilcotin title to their lands, and I'm seeing him again. So I guess I'll see you in about the end of July, based on our schedule right now, Terry. But what I can say about Regional Chief Teegee is that we've learned so much from his work and the work collectively that he represents, so that we can advance collectively at the federal level. Last year's release of the UNDA Action Plan was a key milestone in our journey together. The UNDA Action Plan is a result of a significant consultation and significant cooperation with First Nations and other Indigenous peoples from across Canada. It sets out a distinctions-based roadmap of actions to implement the UN Declaration. Implementing the action plan's 181 measures, which include a number of shared priorities along with those specific to First Nations, is key to advancing Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination and all of the rights and principles set out in the UN Declaration. Our government remains fully committed to working in consultation and cooperation with First Nations rights holders and representative organizations to ensure that the UN Declaration, the UNDA, and the Action Plan are fully implemented here in Canada. What I can say is that we are making progress, as the UNDA annual report suggests, but I'm not blind to the fact that we have plenty of work in front of us. The National Chief reminds me of that all of the time. We want to be the government that continues that work in partnership with you. And I know you would like things to be moving more quickly and have the work to implement UNDA and the Action Plan more supported. I want to find solutions, and I'm committed to finding solutions together with all of you. I'm confident we're moving in the right direction. I want to acknowledge the work of the Chiefs Committee on UNDRIP, as well as the joint work being done by AFN Justice Canada UNDA Working Group, so the joint working group that we have struck. I want to turn to the Action Plan's Shared Priorities Measure 28. And that provision, Shared Priority Measure 28, deals with developing an Indigenous justice strategy. I know that the Indigenous justice strategy has been a priority of the AFN for a very long time. We need a proper response to the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, both as offenders and as victims. We have heard your calls, the calls throughout this room and right across the country, about the need to address overrepresentation. The Indigenous justice strategy is to provide a framework for concrete action to address systemic discrimination, systemic racism, and the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in our justice system. The strategy must accurately reflect the distinct needs and priorities of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis right across the country. That is why we've been working to balance the need for urgency with the need to take appropriate time to ensure the strategy is properly co-developed. We heard you when you called on us to ensure co-development of the strategy. We revised the mandate of the Indigenous Justice Strategy to make this happen. It must match your ambitions and it must match your priorities. And with the renewed federal funding included in the recent budget, more than $25 million over the next 3 years, we are ready for the next phase. That involves consultation and cooperation with Indigenous partners, as well as with provinces and territories on what we call the Key Elements Consultation Draft. We need to get this work done quickly. I think you will all understand why. The runway for implementation is getting shorter. Time is not our ally. My goal is to finalize and deliver the IJS later this year in 2024, so we can start to implement the Indigenous Justice Strategy in 2025. I would also note here that our budget of this year, the 2024 budget, includes immediate investments in the Indigenous Justice Program and the Indigenous Court Worker Program, as well as funding to support, and this is important, the revitalization of Indigenous laws, justice systems, and legal traditions, something that I've heard about from many of you literally across the country. Nous sommes déterminés à appuyer ces programmes alors que nous continuons à finaliser la stratégie et sa vision de la réforme des lois, des politiques et des programmes dans plusieurs domaines. I want to turn now to First Nations laws. I also hear regularly about the need for us to work together, as well as with provinces and territories, to address serious challenges in First Nations communities. These are challenges that touch on areas of my responsibility, as well as my colleagues, the Minister of Public Safety, Crown Indigenous Relations, and Indigenous Services. I'm encouraged by the tripartite work we're doing with First Nations in several provinces and territories, including in relation to the enforcement of First Nations laws. We can only succeed when we collaborate among federal, provincial, and Indigenous governments. We have good evidence of how this can work in practice, with the innovative approaches to enforcement and prosecution of First Nations laws and bylaws that are currently being piloted in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario, for example. And I know my colleague, Dominic LeBlanc, who is just to my right, to your left, will be addressing these important public safety considerations when he speaks to you momentarily. I also want to acknowledge the continuing work under the tripartite MOU between the Government of Canada, the BC Government, and the BC First Nations Justice Council, as well as the Ontario Tripartite Table. I look forward to collaborating with the newly elected Ontario Regional Chief, Abram Benedict, on this important work, as I am also an Ontarian in the Parliament of Canada. I expect that all of this work will feed into Canada's Indigenous justice strategy, creating a shared vision and a durable framework for a fairer justice system in this country. I want to address now the independent special interlocutor. This is the work of Kimberly Murray, acknowledging the tremendous ongoing work that Kim Murray has been doing as the independent special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with Indian residential schools. Ms. Murray and her office have put survivors and their families at the center of their work, as it must be, and we are grateful for the dedication of all involved. I want to acknowledge the grief and the pain that this sacred work entails, as well as the courage and the resilience of those that are undertaking it. The Special Interlocutor's recently released historical report, Sites of Truth, Sites of Conscience, reminds us of how painful and necessary this work is. We must not and cannot ever deny or forget what happened. We've recently extended Ms. Kimberly Murray's mandate into the fall of this year so that she has the time to complete this crucial work, including holding the final national gathering. Nous attendons avec impatience le report final de son bureau cet automne. Il est prévu qu'il contienne des recommandations détaillées sur le respect et la protection des tombes non marquées potentielles, ainsi que l'hommage aux enfants qui n'ont jamais retrouvé leur famille. In conclusion, what I want to say to you is that we often refer to reconciliation as a journey. There is no set destination or a clear arrival point. But there are milestones along the way that we can use to mark our progress and to spur us onward. Implementing the UNDA and the Action Plan measures, developing the Indigenous Justice Strategy, responding to the TRC calls to action, and the National Inquiry into MMIWG calls for justice, which I heard a lot about this morning with the Atlantic Chiefs. All of these are touchstones for challenging but transformational work, and we are doing it together as partners and as allies. I'm encouraged by our progress. Together, I believe we can achieve the vision embodied in the UN Declaration, to uphold Indigenous human rights, to combat systemic racism and discrimination, to advance reconciliation, healing, and peace. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Nyawa miigwech.
Thank you, Minister Virani. Minister LeBlanc, I think you got 13 seconds left after that. So I'd like to invite up Minister Dominic LeBlanc, the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions, and Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. LeBlanc.
Alors, merci beaucoup. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour. Thank you to the elders, leaders, delegates, regional chiefs, and other chiefs present, and particularly to National Chief Woodhouse-Nepanak for the invitation to join you today. It's for me very moving to have this first opportunity to be present at an Assembly of First Nations gathering of this size and this scope. And National Chief, I thank you for your kindness in inviting me and for the work that we've been able to do. And I'm obviously very happy to be here on the traditional territory of the Gayanengak as we work together on the issues that my colleague addressed, Arif Virani, and some of which I'll touch on briefly. I understand you invite somebody, a law professor like Arif, who wants to talk. I was saying to people when we came in, I thought we had 5 minutes each, so he nicely left me with 2. I'll do my best to be brief because both of us are looking forward to your questions. As Arif said, all teasing aside, as we move forward together to create safer communities and build stronger relationships, I would like to express to you my own commitment to reconciliation and advancing self-determination. Ensemble, nous pouvons continuer à créer des résultats positifs pour les Premières Nations partout au pays. Ensemble, nous avons réalisé et nous continuons de réaliser de grands progrès sur nos priorités communes afin d'assurer la sécurité de vos communautés. Since 2018, we've invested significantly to bolster First Nations and Inuit policing program and to further increase access to dedicated, culturally responsive policing services in First Nations communities, but we recognize and acknowledge that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. 3 federal budgets, 2018, 2021, and 2024, outlined significant investments in First Nations and Inuit policing. But as I said, we know there is more to do, both in terms of funding, but in terms of the way the program functions as well. We want to work with you to find lasting and equitable solutions to the public safety challenges your communities face. I know that the introduction of federal legislation recognizing First Nations police services as essential services is top of mind for many of you. It's certainly consistent with my conversation with your national chief and her colleagues, and it's something that we're very committed to doing. Over the last couple of years, we've collaborated towards future legislation with First Nations partners, as well as provinces and territories. Our objective is to ensure these services are well positioned to continue meeting the policing standards that you want for your communities and to respond to those communities' priorities as well. I want to recognize the AFN's work on the safety and policing issues that your communities face, and I especially want to acknowledge the work of your National Chief, of National Chief Woodhouse-Nepanack, and her leadership on this important file. Et évidemment, le chef régional Picard a joué et continue de jouer un rôle essentiel dans cette conversation. Cette loi, en plus de notre travail conjoint, contribuera à soutenir l'autodétermination et sera flexible afin de répondre à l'évolution de l'administration de la justice chez les Premières Nations. Ce projet de loi est une occasion pour le gouvernement du Canada de revoir la façon dont les services de police des Premières Nations sont financés et d'assurer une prévisibilité à vos communautés. Il reste encore beaucoup de travail à faire, mais nous y parviendrons ensemble grâce à une collaboration et un respect continu et à un dialogue franc et ouvert aussi. Et ça, c'était mes expériences très constructives avec votre chef national aussi. Veillez à ce que chacun et chacune se sente en sécurité dans sa communauté est la priorité numéro 1, évidemment pour moi, mais pour notre gouvernement aussi. So once again, thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a true honor. I appreciate the work that I've been able to do and the more work that we have to do together, and I wish you all a great week in this great Canadian city of Montreal. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister LeBlanc. So I would now invite our delegates. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'll ask you to keep your questions short. I know it's a tight timeline, and I'm sorry for that, but we're going to try to keep the agenda. We'll go microphone 1, 2, 1, 2, as we usually process. So microphone 1.
Yes, Chief Leroy Denny, Eskizoni First Nation, Nova Scotia. I want to join also our proxy here, Deanne Sack, with me on the situation happened in New Brunswick, and the person is my band member. She got into, she made a call in New Brunswick with the RCMP, and she ended up being arrested to try to intervene a troubled family member who had a mental health issue, and how they were mocking, the RCMP were mocking the individual, and they end up striking, her name is Christina, the woman, and it really caused an uproar on social media. And this has happened in your backyard, Minister, in New Brunswick. And I know that just a few years back, what happened to Chantel Moore for a wellness check, how she was shot by an officer, and now for Christina, just happened recently, how she was just, her face just got busted up. I have a picture, I'll show it soon, but I just want to mention that. I know there's an investigation for CERT, and I believe that we don't really trust CERT. We should have a involvement from our First Nations, from our leadership of some sort, or as a watchdog, that we don't trust it. If you want trust and faith, we should be part of that process when they investigate officers when they're doing harm, especially on our women, our Indigenous women across this country. Now we'll have Deanne to also say a few words.
My name is Deanne Sack. I'm from Sabag-and-Agadic First Nation, and I'm proxy chief for Chief Michelle. I'm also a retired RCMP officer, 25 years operational policing in the Atlantic region. And when I seen those pictures floating around of that lady, I was heart-wrenched, I was heartbroken. And knowing my history with the RCMP, nothing's really changed. And when Chief Leroy says with CERT, we really need somebody involved to oversee, just to be there to listen and witness how the investigation, that independent investigation is taking place. Because our Ilnu, our people, are the subject matter experts of our communities. We live, we have the connections, we know who's who in our communities, so we're the subject matter experts, not somebody coming into our communities and trying to piece the picture together. So this is why it's important to have somebody that our community members recognize, because they're going to have the cultural competencies, they're going to have the cultural safety, they're going to know the etiquette and the protocols for the communities. I policed the community in New Brunswick one time, and I didn't know who's who, and it took me 6 months to figure out there was, 6 different sets of Smiths in one community. So this is why it's important to have these people kind of be tandem with the investigation, because they are the subject matter. We are. The Ilnu people in the community are the subject matter experts. We know our people. And the irony of this whole situation, this lady, she was wearing a family violence prevention T-shirt. And she sustained not a scratch, and I don't approve or agree how her injuries were minimized. She sustained facial fractures. She needs reconstructive surgery. And that's not even including the trauma that she has to navigate and live with, and the PTSD. And it's heart-wrenching because we have the calls to justice. We have the calls to justice, 231 recommendations. And I know the police force has a lot that they have to adhere to, which brings me to my next topic. The calls to justice have been in place since 2019. Where are you guys at with all that? When do we get feedback on how you guys are processing those calls to justice? Is it a one hit it and quit it tick box and you're done? What sustainable changes are taking place that are going to be extended to the next generations. Sunogama.
I will move to microphone number 2, if you can state your name.
Byron Lewis, Chief of the Okanagan Band. I want to just quickly bring up the whole issue about the non-recognition of Section 83 of the Indian Act. And one of the problems of that is when you come into the province of British Columbia, it's a constitutional issue. In 1871, when the province negotiated their entrance into Canada under Confederation, part of that agreement said that Indians and lands reserved for Indians are the responsibility of the Dominion of Canada. And with the passage of the Cannabis Act by Canada, where it was quickly turned over to the provinces for jurisdiction, that was a constitutional issue that was not addressed in the province of British Columbia. Further to that the federal government and the RCMP will not enforce laws under Section 83 on the Indian reserves. And when you look in British Columbia, you got the Campbell decision of the former Attorney General that went to court on the Nisga'a Treaty, and it was found that while our inherent right to self-government has been infringed, it remains intact. So when we're talking about passing laws such as our Cannabis Acts on reserve, we can't get any type of enforcement whatsoever. And when that was turned over, what that did was opened up possibilities of infractions under FinTrack and other types of acts where you can actually opens the door for money laundering, other types of opportunities such as that actually does happen on these reserves. Now, one of the things that, that it would be simple if the CSU in British Columbia would actually enforce bylaws that are created under Section 83. I'm sick and tired of hearing all this mouth service to, oh yes, we're going to fully, represent UDRIP and all these other acts, but yet there's something that's been in that federal act for the last over 125 years, and we still can't get such things as simple enforcement. And when you look at Section 88 that was put in, I think, in about 1951, that was not constitutional in the province of British Columbia based upon the Articles of Confederation of 1871 that does not recognize any jurisdiction other than the Dominion of Canada on federal reserves and with lands and Indians reserved for the Dominion of Canada. So I think that needs to be addressed because it's a constitutional issue, and also the enforcement of Section 83 bylaws are federal acts and should be respected as such. We always hear about how we're supposed to be, we don't respect laws. Well, are we the only one in those instances? But clearly Canada does not recognize ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Louis. I'll go to one final question. I know it's cutting it short with the amount of people we have at our mics, but I did overhear the minister saying they might be around in different regional caucuses, so try to get your hands on them there. I'll go to microphone number 1.
Miigwech, Minister LeBlanc, for joining our assembly this morning. My name is Elvin Fiddler. I'm a proxy at this assembly for my chief, Charlie Beardy from Musquat Dam. But I'm also the Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation. And we have a two-part question, but I just wanted to just mention very quickly the work that we're doing to empower our own police services to be able to police our own people and our own communities is very much something that we expect Canada to join in and continue those efforts, because we do not trust the mainstream police services. You may have heard last week or 2 weeks ago, for example, one of our community members was killed and shot 3 times by the Ontario Provincial Police outside of Kenora. That funeral just happened 2 days ago. And so we need to move towards empowering and making sure that our own police services like NAPS and Treaty 3 and others have the tools and have the legislative authority to be able to police our own communities. And that's something that we are very much working towards, and we expect Canada to be there with us. But I also just want to take this opportunity to introduce Kai Lu, who is currently the Executive Director of the Indigenous Police Chiefs of Ontario, to ask you a question as well.
Thank you, Grand Chief. Minister, my name is Kai Lu, the Executive Director of the Indigenous Police Chiefs of Ontario. I bring 37 years of policing, of which I spent I was the Chief of Police for 3 police services, including the Treaty 3 Police Service, before retiring and taking the Executive Director position. IPCO represents 9 self-administered Indigenous police services in Ontario, which works with 86 First Nation communities across the province. Our commitment to community safety is to deliver adequate, effective, and culturally responsive policing. My question is based on what I am hearing from the communities we serve about Canada's proposed 2-track approach. We understand that Canada has recognized the distinction between public safety and justice by separating those into 2 different portfolios. Of course, there is an important relationship between safety and justice. However, Canada recognizes that community safety and policing belong in one portfolio overseen by one minister, who is now responsible for co-developing First Nation policing legislation. My question is, how can Public Safety Canada guarantee Indigenous self-determination and inherent jurisdictions will be respected with regards to public safety if those issues are removed from the proposed legislation and sent to some other table overseen by another ministry? Thank you.
Thank you, Proxy Fiddler and Executive Director Lu. I will now turn it over to our 2 ministers to answer, and as I said, after that we will have to break for lunch. Ministers, do you want to come to the stage?
So if, first of all, thank you for the questions, but thank you for the representations as well. With respect to Chief Denny, Chief Leroy, I am aware of that circumstance. I share the understandable pain that the community and the family has felt. I have discussed that obviously with the RCMP leadership. There is, as you noted, a process ongoing, so I can't comment on a specific process that's triggered, but what I can say, and what I heard clearly, is a very thoughtful suggestion about how to include Indigenous people in those reviews. If the RCMP, if it's the Civilian Complaints Review process, and we can always look to improve and modernize those processes to build confidence in the communities that you represent, that are seeing some of these circumstances and these incidents that are obviously extraordinarily upsetting, and I see them up close in New Brunswick, but it's by no means unique to our part of the country. So I will happily work with, and I've had conversations with the Commissioner and the leadership of the RCMP about how we can improve their sensitivity to Indigenous culture and Indigenous communities. I think they have made some significant improvements, but they too have more work to do. I was there at Depot when an Indigenous troop graduated at Depot. Those are small steps, but there are many more that we can take, and I very much like the idea of finding a way to have Indigenous, for all the reasons you said, subject matter experts, people who know the communities. I share totally that perspective, and will work to find a way quickly to include the Indigenous presence in those reviews so that that confidence is not further strained as communities go through these difficult issues. With respect to your colleague, the Executive Director representing the self-administered police services in Northern Ontario, I have learned some of the best examples of successful Indigenous police services are in fact in Northern Ontario. There are others across the country, of course, that are also doing extraordinary work, but my conversations with Premier Ford, my conversations with Indigenous leaders in Ontario, including your new regional chief who spent the day with me in his community a month ago, have told me that in many ways that's exactly a model that we need to build up, to celebrate, and to support. The issue that you raised, the sort of two-track approach, the mandate I have, and this is the conversation I've had with your national chief and others, the mandate I have is to quickly introduce federal legislation which provides long-term, stable, recurring funding and recognizes the essential service that Indigenous policing is, like any other policing in any other non-Indigenous community. When I first met Indigenous police leaders in Northern Ontario, the whole idea that the officers who are serving honorably and effectively in these communities don't know if on April 1st in a new fiscal year there's an allocation of money to continue their policing service makes no sense at all. So how do you build professional policing services and people to have careers doing difficult work in their communities? So I can very quickly, with the Assembly of First Nations, put in before the House of Commons legislation that will recognize recurring long-term funding, reliable, stable funding, and designating the essential service that Indigenous police services represent. That, to me, is a very important first step. If we want to get into a conversation about, and I understand why that's a topic of huge concern for all of you, if we want to have the rights-based discussion about the inherent right to administer the police services, we're going to bump into a federal-provincial dynamic. The provincial ministers have said to me, policing is a provincial jurisdiction. The standards that are set by provincial governments, that's a more complicated conversation. And if we have in the next few months a chance to take a big step forward with federal legislation that binds the Government of Canada to be a long-term, reliable partner as communities build their own police forces as they want to do, I don't want to miss that window. And if we attach it, and I said to your national chief, I'm happy to find the best way to pursue that other conversation, which is very important. But if we want to tie those two together, in my judgment, we're not going to get, in the next few months, legislation before the House of Commons and miss an opportunity to take a big step forward together while finding the right way to continue working on the rights-based piece as well. And that's a commitment that I'm happy to make, and I'm happy to continue the conversation with your national chief and members that you determine are appropriate. Arif?
Sure. I'll just jump in on a few points here. So, I mean, the two big themes that I think that came across from the four interventions that we just heard were issues that relate to shock and horror and disgust in terms of how that woman was treated in New Brunswick at the hands of law enforcement, and also just the baseline lack of trust. Right? So I heard that from Chief Leroy, who's right next to me, but I also heard that on the back end from Chief Fiddler and the Executive Director. And what we need to be doing fundamentally is working on restoring that trust and working with pace to do that, but also thinking as creatively as possible, as Dominic is mentioning, about how do we ensure Indigenous policing and respect for Indigenous laws, bylaws, band council resolutions, etc., because that needs to be where we're moving in terms of this path towards self-determination. Chief Diane Sack, I mean, you mentioned this to me earlier, and you're mentioning it to me again in this open plenary. I hear you 1,000% that you are absolutely right when you say you and others like you are the cultural experts, the cultural competency experts, the people that understand their communities. You are the Indigenous voices that we need to be listening to better in terms of how to address this issue. What I would say to you is you asked about sort of the calls to justice and what's going on post-2019. Work is continuing. Can it go faster? It absolutely can go faster. What I'd say to you to tie back to some of what I said in my opening remarks is that that big document, which is this Indigenous Justice Strategy, dovetails with specific aspects of the calls to justice and the TRC calls to action. It's one piece, but it's an important piece that does right, ideally, once it's fully implemented, does right by women facing violence, but also by a whole host of Indigenous people that have been mistreated on this land. And with respect to, it was Chief Louis, with respect to the consultation piece on cannabis and also about Section 83 and Section 88 of the Indian Act, I'd say just a couple of things as I reflect on that. One is that the consultation piece is meant to be much more comprehensive and much more complementary to any legislative development process, and that's what that UN Declaration Act actually entrenches, right? I'm not sure where he's gone, where he's sitting, but Section 5 of the UN Declaration Act talks about ensuring that the laws of Canada, including laws that we're developing right now, Dominic and I and other cabinet ministers, meet the level of consultation that you're seeking. In terms of sort of specifically addressing, I think Dominic was addressing it in terms of his opening remarks, but it's this idea about ensuring that we recognize that Indigenous people know best what is right for their own communities. We've seen that over and over again on education initiatives out east. We've seen that with NAN in terms of what they've been doing in the region of Ontario. That's absolutely true, but the idea is that if you know how to keep your own community safe and keep them safe from, for example, substance abuse and addictions, predatory behaviors, you name it, then we need to be listening to that and allowing you to enforce your laws if there isn't a way for external law enforcement to be enforcing them. I think both can be true at the same time, but I think we need to be working on it with pace. And I commit to you quite openly that we will do that work because it is necessary, and that's a path forward. I've heard even in the hallways about concerns about substance use and addictions and about how communities are not being kept safe even though you know what's right and what's best for your communities. We need to unlock that and empower that, and that's what we're committed to do. Thank you.
LeBlanc. Thank you, Ministers LeBlanc and Virani. As said, due to time constraints, we will be closing the speakers list there. And I do believe that National Chief has a little token of recognition.